Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thanks once again for stopping by. I trust the week has gone well. And I was talking to somebody yesterday and saying, as I've gotten older, time is flying at such a velocity, it's frightening. I remember being at prep school, and I suppose I'm going to Hannah's speech day today, and that was the same prep school I attended. And I was just thinking to myself, you'd wait for speech day, and it was as if years would pass before it would come around. And now, I go from speech day to speech day as if it was just the next day. We went up to Lower, we had a fabulous time, and we did some filming, and we filmed the Land Rover on safari, the L319 Discovery LR4. And if you get a chance, it's a very short vignette of about 2 or 4 minutes. Do have a look at it, it was a lot of fun. My home thoughts turn to Lao Tzu, that quote I love about water will wear away rock, and I keep quoting it, but I found another one that I like. The master in the art of living makes little distinction between his work and his play, his labor and his leisure, his mind and his body, his information and his recreation, his love and his religion. He hardly knows which is which. He simply pursues his vision of excellence at whatever he does, leaving others to decide whether he is working or playing. To him, he's always doing both. And I thought that was pretty powerful. That's Lao Tzu. I must say I'm rather pleased with the letter I received from Madame Lagarde yesterday. And I'll put up a link for it. And I was invited to be a moderator at the Africa Rising conference in Maputo. I'll put up the poster that was in the conference room. And I'll also put up a link for Christine Lagarde's Mindspeak. Earlier this year we filmed that, and that's on YouTube. And I wrote then, if Mindspeak was an ice cream sundae, then Christine Lagarde's appearance is like the maraschino cherry that you find on top of the sundae. I wrote a piece when I went to that Maputo conference, which was covering not only the conference but the situation in Africa, called Mozambique, Africa Rising. Mozambique could be the next Qatar, and if you fancy having a read, do. It's on Rich Wrap-Ups. And then that photograph that I took of the evening in Maputo, which was so quite amazing, I must say, and I love the colors that you see in this photograph, the palm trees, and then the Indian Ocean, which was in this place. Maputo was the final destination, was the end point in Africa of that reversible escalator monsoon wind. And then I'll put up a photograph of Christine Lagarde, myself, and Hannah, and I got Hannah to present her with some flowers, and Hannah said, I want to be like you, and she said, you can be anything you want to be, and I think that was very powerful. Scientists have discovered a fragment of the missing link asteroid that led to explosion of life on Earth. Scientists in Sweden have discovered a never-before-seen class of meteorite that could be the missing link between a gigantic collision in the asteroid belt 470 million years ago and the subsequent explosion of diverse life forms here on Earth. And the image is quite arresting. Coming on to political reflections, according to Al Jazeera yesterday, a Saudi-owned TV station says 30,000 Saudi troops have been deployed to the Iraq border. And it made me think, of course, Saudi Arabia is one of the chief patrons of the newly termed IS. It just is. But just like the US could redirect to Tehran, I think the IS could redirect in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis would be wise to keep that border under control. The US has sent Green Berets to northern Iraq. Special Forces advisors have set up an operations center in northern Iraq as part of the expanding US political and military effort to keep Iraq from splintering against attacks by Islamic extremists. This is what Chuck Hagel said Thursday. In recent days, a small team of advisors opened up a joint operations center in Erbil, capital of the semi-autonomous Kurdish regional government, Hagel said at a Pentagon briefing with Army General Martin Dempsey. We are not cooperating with Iran now, Dempsey said. It's not impossible that in the future we should have reason to do so. That's interesting. North Korea, this caught my attention in an article about the visit of Xi Jinping to South Korea, saying that North Korea now is extraordinarily dependent on China, and the road to Pyongyang goes through Beijing. The South Korean ambassador, whom I met at the 4th of July celebrations on the 3rd of July last night, told me that actually North Korea was now turning towards Russia, and that was an interesting detail which I wasn't aware of. If South Koreans want the North Koreans to move on any important issues, you've got to get the Chinese on board, because it's only the Chinese that have the leverage to arm twist Pyongyang. Bilateral trade between China and South Korea, $266 billion, up 7.5% from 2012. And then China apparently attacked Japan. Xi Jinping. In the first half of the 20th century, Japanese militarists carried out barbarous wars of aggression against China and Korea, swallowing Korea and occupying half of the Chinese mainland, Xi Jinping said on Friday at the Seoul National University. Pretty hard-hitting. And clearly that it's quite interesting, because both South Korea and Japan are very strong allies of the US, but South Korea and Japan don't see eye to eye, and Xi Jinping has gone for that opening, as seen in this visit. I'll put up a photograph of him shaking the hand of Park Geun-hye at an event yesterday. And then this Facebook controversy. Results indicate that emotions expressed by others on Facebook influence our own emotions, constituting experimental evidence for massive-scale contagion via social networks. Good, an interesting point. To borrow, and then this quote caught my attention, to borrow Henry Kissinger's terminology, independent nationalism is a virus that might spread contagion. And Kissinger was referring to Salvador Allende's Chile then, which was an interesting comment. And then Rob Crilly, who I follow on Twitter, retweeting a fellow called Sagal_J, says China has banned Ramadan fasting in its Muslim province of Xinjiang, which I thought was a very poor decision. Euro back below 136 at 135.99, Japanese yen above 102 at 102.05, so we've seen a strengthening dollar over the last 36 hours. The Swiss franc 0.8939. The pound, however, continues on its merry way, 170.162. Next objective for me is 173.80, Aussie 0.9362. India rupee 59.805, rose 0.7% this week. And this is the biggest gain since the period ended May 16th, and that's because of the remission in the price of crude oil, improving the outlook for the rupee. South Korean won 10.0955, Brazil real 220.98, Egyptian pound 715.02, South African rand 1072.53. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the euro dollar. We've softened a little bit. Draghi, of course, stepped up the rhetoric a little bit over the last few sessions. Dollar index back above 80 at 80.23, but still in that range we've been in for a great deal of time, where it's capped at 81.10 and sort of finds support at around 79 and change. Sterling, I'm going to put up a 3-month chart of that. I've been bullish that a while, and I think we're headed to 2 to 1 eventually. Gold 1319.52. Prices dropped 0.6% yesterday, but touched 1332 on July the 1st, which was the highest since March 24. I'll put up a 1-year chart. I'm not bullish about it, but it's been sort of fairly sticky around these levels when I would have thought it would fall away, but I think it will. Crude oil dipped below 104. It's around 104. I'll put up a 1-month chart. Come off a little bit. No big news out of Iraq. Obviously, some bulls getting a little bit nervous, cutting their positions, but I think it is a trading buy, because I think Iraq remains very, very, very fluid, and it could, redirect in multiple directions. Frontier Markets, a very interesting piece by Katrina Manson. Investors chasing high returns are ready to overlook danger, poor governance, and creaking infrastructure, she's saying. When shooting erupted one night last year throughout Juba, Phil Taylor hit the floor of his room and crawled around for days. We got caught in the crossfire and things got fairly hairy, he says. Bullets were hitting the wall, there were bodies on the street outside. As general manager of Network Support Services, a telecoms tower service provider owned by a UK private equity fund, he has grappled ever since with the impact South Sudan's civil war has had on business. Of the 160 towers he services, 15 are too dangerous to reach. The government forbids servicing in rebel-held areas, and he has lost a vehicle to requisitioning. Day 1, the rebels came and siphoned our diesel. Day 2, they came for the battery. And day 3, they came and towed the whole truck with 2 generators away, he says with a stoic laugh. It's the very definition of force majeure, really. Such is business in a war zone, an example of the risks that go with investing in volatile frontier markets, yet ever more investors keen for high returns, social impact, and an extreme challenge are flocking to Africa's frontier markets, from South Sudan to Sierra Leone, Ethiopia to DR Congo. The push into these markets is an outgrowth of 2 large investment trends: a global hunt for yield, in which investors have pumped money into the sovereign debt of Greece and other countries that were on the verge of economic collapse only a few years ago. A broader narrative of rising African growth, the risks of investing in countries that are often plagued by poor governance, conflict, and weak infrastructure, are being shrugged off by specialist and increasingly mainstream investors. Investors interested in African frontier markets are accessing them through diversified frontier market funds, or using South Africa as a gateway, not so much. In order to avoid being exposed to a number of small, illiquid markets, I think one of the big trends I've seen is the fact that people have moved away from using South Africa as a gateway and have accessed these markets more directly. Sub-Saharan Africa will still garners a tiny proportion of global investment. FDI to the region is rising rose 5% to $56 billion last year. African mergers and acquisitions last year totaled $30 billion, generated by 1,000 deals. Talking about 220 private equity managers targeting Africa. Some of the world's largest fund managers in search of bigger returns are also making forays into these markets. Carlyle Group, KKR entered Africa in June with a $200 million stake in an Ethiopian rose farm. Bob Diamond. Frontier markets may be small, illiquid, and poorly developed, but their expansion from a low base regularly surpasses other emerging markets. The IMF expects frontier Africa growth to outpace even frontier Asia by 2016 at 6% a year, making it the fastest expanding region in the world. Saying that Africa frontier also offers inefficient markets, unregulated monopolies that promise significant rewards. If you've done nothing else, investing in banking, breweries, and cement should make your returns in frontier markets, of Michael Turner of Actis. But with the rise of consumerism, retail, education, and healthcare sectors are growing too. Indeed, they are. The most hardy are keen to manage companies directly. Mr. Taylor, who kayaks the Nile in his spare time, has escaped arrest by young men with bows and arrows by proposing a group photo, perched on a pallet of frozen chickens at the back of an Antonov aircraft to make unorthodox logistics deliveries, and survived regular bandit attacks. His driver's finger was shot off. It's a crazy place. There are almost no rules, so you have to make it up as you go along, and it's quite interesting to have to do that. There's no straightforward solution, he says. Despite the risks, this year is likely to prove NSS's best, not least because of the competition has left South Sudan. Juba's construction and land prices continue to boom, and the currency is largely stable, miraculously. It is amazing how little the breakdown of government affects the economy. Africa's major story is that vibrant economies are growing despite their governments, said the founding partner of Maris Capital. Although not every desk-based investor may wish to negotiate landmines and state disintegration, they do have increasingly easier access to African growth in far-flung frontier markets. Africa has started to get a mature investor base, Before, investors didn't have the luxury of choosing the asset class they wanted, and now they have the choice. And then this is Mohammed Hanif, Chief Executive at Inspiro Asset Management. Cost of buying and selling shares in the least efficient markets is high, above 2.5% of their value in Uganda, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Then saying thanks. I still think that the small caps in the frontier are more interesting than the large liquid names that go up and down on US Fed policy. Good point. Thanks in part to loose monetary policy in the West, African countries are likely to issue record volumes of sovereign euro bonds worth in excess of $11 billion this year, including from Mozambique and Zambia. Some, such as Tanzania, are still liberating government securities to offer them to foreign investors. Local currency bonds can offer as much as twice the return of dollar-denominated ones if investors are prepared to take a punt on inflation. Then saying the other main draw of frontier markets, their growth prospects are so strong they are shielded both from global finance trends and even sometimes domestic events. People talk about Africa being risky, but they don't know what it means. It's constant. The generator breaks down, the national grid isn't on, your ice melts, and you still have to pay salaries. It involves continual crisis management. Very, very interesting article, actually. Do read it. In the frontier markets, if you pick the winner in a market which is growing and often lacking any competition, then the returns are stellar. But you may not make that in 10 years. If we'd kept shares in 2 of our companies in our 10-year fund until today, they would be worth 40 times what we paid 15 years ago, says Mr. Turner. But it requires a long-term commitment to the market. Not all pension funds in the US that are dipping their toe in Africa for the first time are quite prepared for that. Multinationals such as Nestle have always known this and are better placed to play the long game in Africa. In the past 6 years, it has built 2 factories in Kenya and DR Congo in an attempt to serve some of the most underdeveloped markets. Sub-Saharan Africa, I return to that story, how leaders at the African Summit voted to have immunity from war crimes and genocide prosecution. I'll put up a photograph from that very summit. Vote took place on Friday at an African Union summit in Equatorial Guinea. Poor decision, I thought. South African all shares up 12.2405% and at a fresh record high, ticked up a marginal 0.07% yesterday. Dollar rand still soft, 10.7223. Strike action obviously putting a crimp on it. Egyptian pound at 7.15. We've been there for a while. The Egyptian stock market is up 21.763%, jumped 1.43% yesterday. As I said at the beginning of January, if the equity markets had a vote in Egypt, Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi would actually get one of those impossible to believe votes of 99.8%. Egypt is to start implementing a capital gains tax on Sunday, passed the law on Tuesday imposing a 10% tax on capital gains and stock dividends. Nigeria all share up 3.283%, and that too is at a more than 5-year high. The Ghana Stock Exchange is up 10.909% this year. But as I'll show you on the Ghana SEDI chart, we're down nearly 30% on the SEDI. And then an article about HFC Bank, which is predicting 4 to the dollar for the SEDI. The SEDI may fall to 350 and 4. It dropped 1.4% to 324. In Accra, down 27% this year. The central bank will probably raise rates by 200 basis points at its next meeting on July 9. I know the president speaks of a homegrown solution. Unfortunately, I don't think there is one, and I think the sooner they call in the IMF, the better. Barclays Investment Bank hires in Africa was a headline I saw, but I like this comment. Chairman David Walker is very supportive. Board members come and visit us. That never used to happen. Foot traffic is what I call that. Sasol is considering a gas to liquids plant in Mozambique with any spar of Italy, and that's why I was saying, Mozambique could be the next Qatar. And then I saw this tweet from the Daily Monitor in Uganda. A Ugandan army clad in camouflage and battle dress take over Kampala, and that goes back to that report that came out yesterday from the US Embassy in Kampala, a very specific attack on Entebbe Airport. Coming to Kenya, obviously on Monday we got this big Saba Saba rally. Saba Saba is, I typed in Saba Saba into Google, and this is what came back to me. Saba Saba Day on July the 7th celebrates, among other things, the 1954 founding of the Tanzanian political party TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union. Of course, here it has different connotations. It goes back to the fight against single-party rule at the time of President Moi. Saba Saba was this big event that was held, and essentially forced the president to compromise in a big way. The erstwhile prime minister is holding a rally. There are concerns that this should not spill out onto the streets. If you're looking for risk, the risk is that somehow, the street gets infected and what was a rally becomes something completely different. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the government should be commended, in point of fact, for making sure the rally happened. As long as they secure it and we don't have a mess on our streets, then I think we're all well and good. Yesterday I attended the 4th of July celebrations at the US Embassy. I'll put up a selfie with myself with the I went up to the ambassador and I said, you know what? And he said, you're not going to ask me for a selfie? And I said, yes, and I did. But it looks a little bit eerie, I must admit. And he's got an op-ed piece in The Nation saying the US Embassy in Nairobi is open for business and we have no intention of closing it. It's good to know. He also said, recently, however, some have questioned our partnership and spread unfounded rumors. Here are the facts. The US has excellent relations with the government and people of Kenya. We do not support any political party or any particular politician in Kenya. We support the ideals and principles set out in Kenya's constitution and our own. The US seeks to help Kenya expand its economy and create jobs. Our travel warnings summarize the security situation in Kenya to allow American citizens to make informed decisions about travel. They do not tell Americans to avoid Kenya. Then, moving on, according again in the Business Daily, the United States of America has overtaken China to become Kenya's second largest source of imports, defying recent cooling diplomatic relations with East Africa's largest economy and Nairobi's decade-long policy of looking east. The value of US exports to Kenya rose to 29.5 billion shillings in May, compared to China's 21.1 billion. America also rose to become the largest consumer of Kenyan exports during the same month, overtaking Uganda, which has held the top spot in the past 6 years. And the other point to make is that North America purchased 66% of our $2 billion worth of Eurobonds. And that's why, I've been talking about it for a while, the disconnect between the economic reality and some of our foreign policy. And I like to think that it's now readjusting back into equilibrium, hopefully. Kenya's shilling was last trading at 87.917. That's quite soft, but key support is at 88 to 88.50. The shilling has lost 1.25% so far this year. Duncan Kinuthia told Reuters that the markets had already priced in the political noise, but that could change if things got out of hand, which goes back to the point I was making. If sudden pronouncements are made, or we have riots or any sort of violence, that obviously could impact the currency negatively, he said, and he's right. The Nairobi All-Share closed down 0.66% yesterday. It remains 11.694% to the good this year. The NSE 20 back in negative territory, having coming within a whisker of unchanged for the year, is down 0.8526% this year. Of course, we did that footage with Jaguar in the jungle. Do have a look at that one. At lower, I'll put up a photograph of a 3V6 convertible, and also a link for Dr. Christian Turner taking a spin in the Jaguar. And oh my goodness, how many people have watched that bit of footage. Now, Adam Wishart, who came across me over Twitter, has put together a very interesting documentary, The White Widow Searching for Samantha. The document, obviously Samantha Luthwaite is one of the world's most wanted terrorists. Widow of Jermaine Lindsay, one of the 7/7 bombers, claimed ignorance of her husband's lethal intentions. She said she was a victim too, but now she's on the run, somewhere in Africa, charged with conspiracy to cause explosions. For 3 years, British, American, Kenyan security forces have been after the so-called White Widow. But what strange journey has this former sixth form schoolgirl from a quiet home county's market town taken? How did she end up as the friend and confidant of some of the top echelons of Al-Qaeda? Filmmaker Adam Wishart has spent a year tracking down the real story of Samantha Luthwaite. I'm halfway through it, I'm about to finish it, for the first time revealing her path to radicalization and the hate preacher who inspired her. I wrote that piece, which was done immediately after Westgate. I'll put up a photograph of Westgate that I took from CNBC's bureau, which is some distance away, and that was, according to my TwitPic, 283 days ago. How time has gone by. And at that time, I was making some inferences around the Al-Shabaab Twitter handle, the linguistics of it, I referred to 14-hour standoff relayed in 1,400 rounds of bullets and 140 characters of vengeance and still ongoing. Good morning, Kenya. That tweet came out in the middle of the night. Another read, here are two of the Mujahideen inside Westgate Mall, unruffled and strolling around the mall in such sang-froid manner. And I kept thinking to myself, sang-froid, there's no one in Mogadishu who'll have a clue what that meant. And it means coolness of mind, calmness, composure, a kind of cold-bloodedness under pressure. And therefore, I connected that with Samantha's father, who was in the military. He would be a sort of person who would be using that word, and my implication was that she was somehow involved in that Twitter feed. And actually, that's the other point I want to make of how incredible this is. ISIS, ISIL, Al-Shabaab are at communicating, given that people keep saying they're stuck in a cave communicating with pigeons. They're not. They're in the 21st century, apparently. And I'm going to leave it at that and wish you a tremendous weekend, and thank you once again for coming by.